The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to our first ever Priton Group Town Hall. And this is the first of 4 that we're going to be doing between now and the end of the year. Today's is going to be on advanced AP coding within the FileBound workflow. We're going to follow that up with 3 additional town halls, the next being on November 11th, where we're going to talk about automating your onboarding processes using FileBound. On December 2nd, we're going to talk about contract management and e-signature through FileBound. And on December 16th, we're going to have one on FileBound Connect. And many of you may be using Connect today, but this is on a different component within Connect. And it's a whole new way to manage your workflow. And we're kind of excited about that. We've shared this with a couple of users, and they really like the options that it provides them as far as having their people gain access to information. My name's Jack Arnston. I am one of the principals at the Priton Group, and joining me today is Bill Prohoda, my business partner, and JD Arnston, one of our senior systems engineers. Our agenda for this morning, we're going to start by talking about how we come across new enhancements, how we make improvements to the solutions that we provide to you. And then once we do that, we're going to get under the hood and show you how we actually build it. In this case, we're going to show you the AP coding and how we build that and how it works. Once we finish that component, we're going to walk you through what the end user's experience looks like. So what are the screens like? What do they do with it? And then we're going to have questions and a wrap up following that. Now, because this is a town hall, we really do need your participation, and you've got a couple of different ways in which you can do that. You can ask a question via the chat session within the GoToWebinar interface. So you can type in your question there. You can hit send. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll be able to ask those to our people here. Another option that you've got is you can raise your hand. You should see a little hand that's available for you. And if you click on that, that will let me know that you have a question you'd like to ask. I will introduce you, unmute you, let you ask your question and any follow-up questions you might have, and just another way that you can participate. I also want to let you know that we'll be recording this session and have it available for you so that you can rewatch or re-listen to it or share it with a colleague. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bill Prohoda. He's going to get us started. Bill?
Thanks, Jack. So what kind of led us to this point? Well, there once was a client, and then another, and then another. A few years ago, FileBound created the related files feature in FileBound, which allowed our clients to code their expense and PO related invoices. This basically just allowed them the opportunity to enter in their GL codes and their distribution amounts. And from there, then we could use the workflow to backfill things like the description fields and other data that we might wish to use within our approval process. Later then, FileBound added the additional advanced line items module, which allowed us to do lookups on the GL codes and lookups on the description, and we can enter in the distribution amounts. And both those features allowed us then easily to deploy those solutions for our clients to be able to code their line items. Now, as our clients began using more and more of the features, we kept getting responses or requests to provide a more automated way of generating the line items. So many of the accounting systems we found allowed for the designation of a default GL code or GL codes. And our clients wanted a way to leverage that information so that it can reduce the amount of data entry. So in addition, they also wanted the ability to automate the calculations of the distributed amounts. See, some of the vendor invoices could be distributed across a single GL code, but many others required one or more GL codes, and then the distributions also needed to be calculated. And sometimes those distributions were either fixed values or percentage values. So by working with our clients, our guys were able to sort of study the specific needs, and then they created a script process as a part of the workflow that allowed them to customize and leverage the existing data. So if an invoice, for example, was associated with a PO, we were able to use the PO GL code entries. For non-POs, we were able to create a project in FileBound, that would hold the vendor ID, the GL codes, the descriptions, the distribution method, and whether that was fixed or percentage, and then gave us what the calculated amounts were. And so what you're going to see today is sort of a result of that process that our technical guys went through to help sort of create that solution. So what's the big benefit? Well, in the end, what we're finding is that it's allowing us to accelerate and automate the entry of the GL coding process during the workflow. It allows us to leverage the POs against the vendor invoice so that, although it doesn't have to be, but there's the potential then to have automatic approval and quicker payments. And so you're actually given the opportunity then at that point to decide if you want to automate that process even further or drop it in somebody's lap to take a look at. Now, in the end, it results, we hope, in less data entry for everyone. And that means that there'll also be less human error. Now, what we mean by that then is we're still empowering the user if you do send it on after we've coded it for approval. It's still given the ability to modify the data to fit any sort of extenuating circumstances. But our hope is that the vast majority of the coding efforts are done in an automated fashion, and then that accelerates the entire process. So let's look at this from the standpoint of a tale of 3 invoices. So the first invoice you'll see is from IP Pathways. Now, that's a purchase order invoice. So it has GL coding associated with the purchase order that's stored in FileBound. So what allows us to use the GL coding from the PO to populate the invoice, GL line items. And then, like I said earlier, if it matches, we then have the opportunity and the potential to auto approve or to decide to send it to somebody for further approval. The second invoice is Info Bunkers. Now, that's a non-PO invoice, but that has a fixed distribution, which is great for the invoices that charge the same amount every month, sort of predictable dollar amount, expected dollar amount. And since those values are taken right from the vendor line items project that we're creating, it's easy to catch anything that's out of balance, because if we expect a specific dollar amount every month and then we code it to that dollar amount and the invoice is off or different, then we can catch that imbalance very easily. And then the third is Cities Digital. Now that again is a non-PO invoice, but this time it's a percentage distribution invoice. So this is great for shared services across departments and locations where each department or location or account needs to share or take their share of the expense. And that's usually reflected, we found, as a percentage value. So Cities Digital will show how we're able to designate the percentages to account for that. So as Jack said, we're going to lift the hood just a little bit. We're just going to cover very quickly sort of what we do and how we do it for both purchase orders and for non-purchase orders where we rely on a project that we create in FileBound. So JD is going to take you through that. So JD, if you would, can you help to explain some of those processes for us?
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. So we'll start off with our first example, which is IP Pathways, where we'll code line items to an invoice that are pulled from that invoice's PO line items. In order for this to be accomplished in FileBound, we do need to have the PO associated with the invoice already stored in FileBound's PO project. And from there, we also need to have the PO line items already entered for that PO. Using PowerShell scripting and FileBound's workflow, we can then automatically copy the PO line items over to the AP Invoices line items. In our other 2 scenarios, which is coding line items based off fixed amounts and percentages, we use a default GL codes project in FileBound. So in this example, you can see that we already have line items populated for Cities Digital in this project. In this case, we use the letter P to signify to the workflow that these line items should be coded to a percentage. We then have a specific percentage designated to each GL code. So you'll see here we'll ultimately end up with 3 line items. The first 2 will be coded to 40% of the invoice total, and the last one will be coded to 20% of the invoice total. The workflow will then use PowerShell to code these 3 line items based off of those percentage distributions, and that data gets entered into the AP line items. In our last example, InfoBunker, we are coding to a series of fixed amounts. This is done for invoices that we already know how much they should be coded to. So in this case, we use the F instead of P for fixed amount to designate how the invoice should be coded. We then code 4 line items set to the distribution amounts, again using workflow and PowerShell. So I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Bill, and he can actually walk through how these invoices are routed with you.
Great, thanks, JD. So we're going to just begin by identifying the 3 invoices that we've talked about so far. And you can see these 3 invoices are currently awaiting workflow routing. So they're not in the workflow yet. And what will happen is when we finally put them into the workflow, that's when we'll start to apply some of these processes. Now you'll see that the 2 of the 3 invoices do not have a purchase order number, so they're kind of considered non-PO expense. And then the 1 does have the purchase order number. So if we were to select these 3 and route them into the invoice approval workflow, you'll see that the status will change, which most of you who use workflow understand how we use status to help empower us to understand where the document is in the workflow. You'll see it says pending assignment for approval, which means that it has gone into the workflow, but it's now stopped at a queue stop. And on its way to that spot is where we applied the processes we've just discussed, where we've either identified that there is a purchase order, and therefore we look to the purchase order project to provide the information we need to code it, or if it's a non-purchase order, expense type related invoice, then we will go to the default line items project for the vendor and grab the necessary information from there. So let's just take a quick look at those invoices and kind of walk through just what it looked like now that they've been coded. So the first invoice you're going to see is IP Pathways, and that's the purchase order invoice. And so what we did is we just went out to the purchase orders project in FileBound. We found the purchase order and the GL line items that were associated with it. And then I took that information and dropped it into the line items detail for this invoice. And so we were able to match up the 2. Now, if we have a process that identifies that all those matches worked out, we could then push that all the way through as an accelerated approval process. Or once it's been identified here and coded, then we can move it to the next person for approval. Our second invoice here is InfoBunker, and that's the one we were talking about. That was a non-PO invoice, but it was a set or fixed dollar amount. So again, we went to this time, I should say, we went to the vendor GL code project. We found the vendor and we found the GL line items that have been identified as default or pre-coded GL line items for them. And because it's a fixed dollar amount for this particular invoice, as you see those 4 values, we then take that information and we transfer it to the line items project within the invoices project, and it's ready to go. It's balanced, there's no variance, and we can move it on to the next person for validation and approval. And even as I said earlier, if as a user, I could choose to then modify, in the event that you empower your users to do this, I could then go in and modify these GL codes and GL lines for any potential extenuating circumstances that I have based on this particular invoice. And now our third is Cities Digital. And similarly to InfoBunker, it is a non-PO invoice, but this particular one is set as a percentage distribution, because that's the nature of this vendor's relationship and coding process. So you can see we've gotten the information from the vendor GL code project set to a percentage of 40, 40, and 20%. And then we've transferred that to the line items detail screen, and we did the calculations to distribute it at 40, 40, and 20%, as you see here. So just as an example, those are the 3 examples that we've put together to show how we're able to, in the same workflow, as the invoices flow through the system, identify which method to use based on either the vendor within the default GL line items project for the vendors, or as a PO, and then we grab the PO data. So with that, Jack, I'm going to open up for any of the questions that might have come in, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Bill. And just a reminder, there's two ways that you can ask questions. The first is through the chat area, and you can type in your message there and hit send, and I'll read it off. The second is you can raise your hand, and I will unmute you and ask you to ask your question. So I'd like to see everyone participate. So please do so. I have a couple of questions here that did come in, and so we'll start with these. The first one is, how did the purchase order and that GL code actually get into FileBound?
Great. Okay, good question. There's a kind of a double answer to this based on whether it's a purchase order invoice or whether it isn't. So if it's a purchase order invoice, generally when we have clients that have a lot of purchase orders and you really want to integrate that into this process, we will work with them and we'll use our integration tools to work with their accounting or their accounting system and ERP or accounting system. And we will work with them to pull that information over. Now, our goal is to be able to grab both the purchase order and its data, and then the purchase order line items that go with it, if that's available to us from the accounting and ERP system. And so we'll pull that over through our integration tools to do that. We try to create as much of a bi-directional opportunity within our workflows as possible. And this is one way to extract that information, pull it down through our integration tools. Similarly, when it's a non-PO, we then will populate that project that we create of default line items for the vendors. And again, there we'll use whatever integration we can to pull down if your ERP and accounting system provides us the opportunity of grabbing what you have already in that system designated as the default GL codes or GL codes. And so we will look to pull those down and populate them. And then you may end up taking that data and updating it with what the distribution amounts are or the percentages are if it doesn't already exist. So we work really hard to do that as much as we can from an automated perspective.
Thanks, Bill. Here's another one from Sam. How do we integrate with our ERP software?
Sure. Yeah, just as I mentioned a little bit earlier, just now, we work with your ERP system now, whether that's directly with you and your IT staff, or whether it's with the provider of your ERP system. But we work with them to try to find the best way that we can integrate. In other words, use our integration tool, FileBound integration tool, to reach out to either the data system itself or to take scheduled exports of the data and then bring that into FileBound to populate, as I said earlier, the purchase order project and the purchase order line items, or the default GL code project for the vendors. Well, we will bring the vendors down on a regular basis. And that integration, if we can accomplish it, will become a live real-time integration as much as we can, so that if you were to add a new vendor, we can pull them in. As you create new purchase orders, we bring them in on a scheduled basis, whether that's 2, 3, 4 times a day or once a day as a schedule allows.
Thanks, Bill. And here's one from Melissa. This is also an integration question. Since we're doing our GL coding within FileBound, how would that information then get transferred to our ERP system?
Great. Yep. It's almost the opposite of what I've just been talking about in terms of the work. We're talking about pulling the data in order to populate the PO project and the project in FileBound for the vendor GL line items. At the end of our workflow, we actually have a process then that we work with from an integration perspective to push out that data. So if we push out the invoice information, the invoice number, the invoice date, the invoice amount, the vendor, the distribution amounts by line items out to the integration element. Now, sometimes that's pushed out as a CSV file and imported into the accountant's ERP system, or sometimes it's a direct integration that we're able to accomplish. And part of that is determined by what tools are available to us by your accounting system. And so we try to set up that integration as much as we can. We have integration tools that allow us to push that information out. We can connect to the other systems, and if we can, then we push that data across automatically. The idea is, in the end, that we get all of that information over for you then to post to your accounting system and then push through for payment via check or ACH.
Okay. Hey, JD, you had showed the in the setup, you had the P for percentage, the F that you showed in there. Once you get that set up, is that something that is kind of hard coded then into the workflow, or is that something that can be changed by either a user or a system administrator? How difficult is it to make changes to that or update that?
Yeah, so it's not, the way that we designed it was deliberate in that it's not hard coded to the workflow, so it simplifies things in that regard. Depending on how a company has their security set up, if you have the user rights to go in and change that value, then you can certainly go in there and change them individually on the fly. If for any reason there's a large number of them that need to be updated, we can certainly also do that using FileBound's importer and simplify that process with an Excel spreadsheet and import the data and update it in FileBound. So there is a variety of ways to manage that data. So it's fairly straightforward and simple.
Okay, thank you. Waiting for some additional questions to come in. If you have any, please feel free to submit them or raise your hand, and we'll get you on the call. One other thing to mention as well, and Bill, if you want to expound upon that, that's fine. How we come about understanding these breakdowns with people that use the system. How do we determine what those percentages might be, things like that, and can they be different between different users?
Sure, Jack. Most of the time, and most of our clients we have working with the systems right now, understand that we spend a good deal of time in what we call a discovery portion. Well, we'll actually sit down with our clients and we'll figure out, and they'll share with us what their processes are, and we'll ask questions that'll help us to hone in on exactly what the right processes are. And in the case of determining whether it's a fixed amount or percentage amount, as an example here, we just simply talk about what the options are, what customers they get in. I'm sorry, not customers, vendors they get invoices from, and then from there we simply determine if a percentage process works, if a fixed dollar amount works, or a combination thereof. So we spend time, and in addition to that, it's not just figuring out what the percentages are, but let's say that it is a PO invoice and the PO comes in and the dollar amounts all match. Well, yes, we can accelerate that, push that through for automatic payment, but it might be such a thing that within your organization, you don't want automatic to go through. You may always insist that somebody see and review that invoice, even though it matches 100%. So we find out those things, and then we fashion the workflow to facilitate those needs.
Perfect, thank you. Well, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for right now. You still have time to submit one. I'd like to remind you that coming up, we have the 3 additional town halls, the next one being November 11th. That's going to be on automating your onboarding process. And that's going to be both for vendor onboarding on the AP side, but also for employee onboarding from an HR perspective. So we're going to talk about both of those. That'll be on November 11th. Some of you have already signed up for that. We'll have another invite that gets sent to you, so you have an opportunity to do that if you'd like. The next will be on the contract management and e-signature through FileBound. That's going to be on December 2nd. And the last will be December 16th, and that's going to be on FileBound Connect, a new way to manage your workflow. And one other thing I'd like to also let you know about, and some of you may have heard about this already. As we've talked to many of you since the pandemic started and a lot of the lockdowns occurred, we kind of heard a reoccurring theme, and one of those was, thank goodness we had FileBound. That, with all our people working from home or working remotely out of the office, I don't know how we could have managed our AP approval process without the FileBound workflow. And that was really gratifying to hear, and we appreciate that. But there's something else that we heard from people too. The one kind of Achilles heel to this whole thing was we still had to have someone come in the office at least a couple times a week to process the vendor invoices into the system. Now, many of you have advanced capture software, but you still have to have someone to kind of look through that and manage that, and you have paper invoices that come in as well. So as we heard that, we started to do some more research, and you guys got us thinking. And after months of planning on this, we're excited to announce that we've got an additional feature that we can offer to you, or additional service, and that is the ability for you to outsource your vendor invoice processing to us. What we can do is we can set up to make that an automated function where we receive both your digital invoices and potentially your paper invoices as well. And we process them using our advanced capture software, which many of you are aware of or used to. But we also do a manual human check of all the information it goes through. And so with that, we can guarantee a 99% accuracy. And then we upload it back into your workflow, and it will kick off the workflow for those vendor invoices as you receive them. And we'll do all that within a 24-hour turnaround. We've had a number of people that have already asked us more details on that. If you're interested, we'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. You can feel free to give me a call, or you can go to our website. We've got a page out there that describes this further. But if there's interest, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. So with all that said, we would like to thank all of you for attending today. We hope that this was worthwhile, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.